Imagine a night like any other, a police officer on his usual patrol, doing what he believes is his duty. But in an instant, a decision based on prejudice turns his life upside down. He arrests a black man, convinced he's just dealing with another routine case. But what he doesn't know is that he just handcuffed the governor of the state. What happens next will leave you speechless. Want to find out how this story ends? Then keep watching and get ready for a twist you'd never see coming. Hello my friends, I'm here to ask a huge favor from you. If you enjoy the videos on our channel, I kindly ask you to subscribe and help us reach the milestone of 1,000 subscribers this month. Subscribe and help us make this dream come true. It was a night like many others, but for Ethan, a veteran police officer, each patrol carried its own load of tension and expectations. The neighborhood he patrolled, known for its dark streets and winding alleys, had brought him more than a few problems over the years. The car's engine purred softly as he drove, his eyes scanning the sidewalks, the corners of buildings, looking for any sign that justified his presence there. The yellowed streetlights cast shadows that danced with the wind, creating a scene that felt even more hostile at that hour of the night. Ethan, with a steady hand on the wheel, couldn't shake a certain discomfort, a tension that built up in his shoulders, making him more alert. He had seen it all in this part of the city: fights, muggings, and other situations that stained the peace of that place. The night patrol had always been a challenge for Ethan. He knew the dangers were real, but over time, something more insidious had infiltrated his perception: the prejudice. It was something he would never admit aloud, but night after night, it shaped his view of the world around him. The faces he saw became suspicious, the movements, no matter how harmless, always seemed loaded with intent. As he drove through the streets, a constant thought hammered in his mind: better safe than sorry. And it was with this mentality that he approached his work, firmly believing he was there to maintain order, to protect people, even if sometimes it meant acting before thinking. And that was exactly what began to unfold that night, a night that, unbeknownst to him, would change his life forever. The radio in the car crackled with the voices of other officers reporting incidents in other parts of the city. Ethan, for his part, continued his vigil, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead, ready to intervene at any sign of danger. The neighborhood was too quiet, a silence that brought an unsettling feeling, like the calm before a storm. But that night, what he couldn't foresee was that the real storm would not come from the dangerous streets he knew so well, but from within himself. Ethan still didn't know it, but the fine line between protection and prejudice was about to be exposed, revealing a truth he never expected to confront. The night wore on, and Ethan continued his patrol, immersed in thoughts. The streets were still empty, but he knew it only took an instant for everything to change. And that was exactly what happened. Amid the play of light and shadows, a figure appeared at the end of the street, walking slowly, almost as if he were simply enjoying the cool night air. It was a man, dark-skinned, wearing a simple coat. Ethan frowned, his mind working at high speed, analyzing every detail of the scene. He slowed the car, observing the man more closely. Something about him stirred an old distrust, that uncomfortable feeling Ethan knew all too well. Why was he walking around here at this hour? The question echoed in Ethan's mind, and before he could consider another answer, his police instinct, or perhaps something deeper, took control. He decided to act. He parked the car and got out, moving with the authority that years of service had granted him. His hand rested lightly on his holster, not out of necessity, but out of habit, an automatic gesture. Ethan was not a man of harsh words without reason, but that night, something compelled him to approach the man directly, almost brusquely. "Good evening. Can I ask what you're doing out here at this hour?" he asked, his voice firm, leaving little room for conversation. The man stopped, turned slowly, his eyes meeting Ethan's. There was surprise on his face, but also a calmness that the officer did not expect. "I'm just heading home," he replied, his voice steady, showing no sign of hostility. But for Ethan, the man's calmness was not enough. Something inside him insisted that the situation was not so simple. He then decided there was no time to waste on words. "I need to take him to the station," he thought. He justified to himself that he was merely doing his job, ensuring the safety of the neighborhood. With a firm gesture, he asked the man to accompany him. "You're going to have to come with me," Ethan said, offering no further explanation. The man, still not resisting, agreed. There was something in his gaze, a mix of resignation and understanding, as if he knew it would be futile to argue. Ethan, for his part, prepared for a long night at the station, believing he was once again fulfilling his duty. But what he still didn't know was that this seemingly routine decision was about to change everything, for both of them. The station, with its concrete walls and fluorescent lights, had never been a welcoming place. And that night, as Ethan and the man he had just arrested entered, the air felt even heavier. The environment was familiar to Ethan, almost like a second home, but for the man beside him, it was a different experience, one he endured with a calmness that, in a way, intrigued the officer. Ethan led Malcolm, the man whose name he now knew, to the detention room. The silence between them was dense, laden with everything that had gone unsaid. Malcolm did not ask questions, did not offer resistance, he simply followed the instructions with a silent dignity that disarmed any attempt at intimidation. But Ethan, still convinced he was doing the right thing, did not relent. To him, Malcolm was just another suspect, another number on a list for a busy night. As he filled out the necessary paperwork, Ethan felt a strange discomfort, a sense that something was off, but he quickly pushed it aside. He had been through similar situations before, and he always followed procedures. But that night, the certainty that usually guided him began to waver. Perhaps it was the way Malcolm carried himself, or maybe the absence of any concrete evidence that something was amiss, but Ethan couldn't stop questioning his own decision, even if he didn't want to admit it. Minutes passed, and the detention room remained silent, broken only by the sound of the clock on the wall. Malcolm, sitting calmly, stared ahead, as if waiting for something. Ethan, still immersed in his paperwork, couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not just by Malcolm's eyes, but by something larger, something he couldn't identify. Finally, the silence was broken. Another officer entered the room, casting a quick glance at Malcolm before approaching Ethan. "Do you know who he is?" he asked, his voice heavy with a curiosity that Ethan didn't immediately grasp. "He's just a suspect," Ethan replied, trying to maintain a professional tone. But his colleague's words echoed in his mind. "Who is he? What did he mean by that?" The officer handed Ethan a file, and as he read it, Ethan's world stopped for a moment. The file revealed Malcolm's identity, and the truth it brought was so shocking that Ethan could hardly believe it. Malcolm was not a criminal, nor just some random suspect. He was the new state governor, conducting a personal inspection, something nobody had expected. And at that moment, the gravity of Ethan's mistake fell upon him like an avalanche, bringing with it the weight of all the poorly considered decisions he had made that night. Ethan felt the weight of the world on his shoulders as he held that file, his eyes fixed on the name that now made his mind spin. Malcolm was not just any man, and certainly not a criminal. He was the governor, a figure of authority and respect, someone Ethan was supposed to protect, not wrongfully arrest. The file in his hands felt heavier with each passing second, as if every letter printed there was screaming a truth he had tried to ignore for so long. The air in the detention room seemed to have grown denser, and the silence, which had previously felt like a simple absence of sound, was now deafening. Ethan slowly raised his eyes to Malcolm, who remained seated, calm, as if he already knew this moment would come. There was no anger on his face, only a serene, almost resigned expression that made Ethan feel even smaller in light of the enormity of his mistake. Malcolm, sensing the change in Ethan's posture, merely nodded slightly, as if giving the officer time to process everything. "Now you understand, don't you?" Malcolm finally said, his voice soft yet laden with meaning. There was no sarcasm, no irony, just a sad acknowledgement of what had happened. Ethan swallowed hard, unable to respond immediately. Everything he believed he was doing right that night was crumbling before him. The truth settled in Ethan like a sharp knife, cutting through his prejudices and revealing how wrong his approach had been. He, who had so often prided himself on his intuition, on his ability to judge a situation in seconds, now saw how those very skills had betrayed him. The shock was not just from Malcolm's identity, but from what this revelation exposed about himself, about his deepest flaws. "I was just trying to ensure safety," Ethan murmured, more to himself than to Malcolm. But the justification sounded empty, weightless, as if the words were dissipating in the air before they could truly make sense. Malcolm watched him with a patience almost paternal, like someone who had been through many difficult situations in life and knew that sometimes the best response was simply to listen. Shame mixed with a deep regret began to take hold of Ethan. He knew there was no excuse for what he had done, and the idea that his mistake could have far greater consequences than he had imagined haunted him. The file in his hands now felt like it was burning, as if each letter written there was a silent accusation of everything he should have seen but chose to ignore. The gravity of the moment hung in the air, and Ethan knew nothing would ever be the same again. He was at a crossroads, a chance to reflect and change, or continue down the same path that had led him here. The silence in the detention room was almost palpable. Ethan, still holding Malcolm's file, felt the weight of what he had done, but the worst was yet to come. As his mind tried to process the revelation, a wave of conflicting emotions hit him. It was as if he were in a battlefield, not against criminals, but against his own beliefs and prejudices. Everything he thought to be true was now in question, and the man he had detained, sitting there calmly, was the embodiment of everything he had never faced within himself. Malcolm finally broke the silence, his voice cutting through the air like a fine blade. "Do you see now, Ethan, what your prejudices can do?" The words were not accusatory, but rather filled with a sadness that Ethan had never felt before. He was not just facing a governor, he was facing a mirror reflecting all his flaws, his mistakes, his blind assumptions. Ethan tried to speak, but the words felt stuck in his throat. He had always seen himself as a good cop, someone who did what was right, who maintained order. But that night, he realized he had confused order with control, justice with hasty judgment. And now, this realization was tearing him apart inside. The walls he had built over the years, made of certainties and routines, were crumbling under the weight of this new reality. I didn't know," he finally managed to say, but the phrase sounded empty, powerless. It was the truth, but a truth that didn't matter now. The damage was done. Malcolm simply nodded, as if he had expected this response. There was no anger in the governor's eyes, only a deep weariness, as if he were tired of seeing the same scenario repeat night after night, with different protagonists, but always the same story. The clash of realities that Ethan was experiencing now was devastating. He realized he had spent years shielding himself from the outside world with armor made of prejudices he didn't even know he carried. And now, unprotected, he felt the crushing weight of raw, unfiltered truth. He was not the hero he thought he was, and that night proved it painfully. As these truths were revealed, Ethan began to feel a new emotion emerging from within him, not just regret, but a burning desire to do things differently. What he would do from that moment on would define not only his career, but also who he truly was. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance for redemption. But before anything else, he would have to confront the most difficult person to face, himself. Ethan stood there, immersed in his thoughts, the file of Malcolm still in his hands, but now with a different weight. He knew he had crossed the line that night, and there was no going back. But before he could drown in his own guilt, Malcolm, with the same calm he had maintained throughout the night, did something unexpected. Instead of demanding severe punishment, instead of letting anger or resentment take over, Malcolm offered Ethan something he would never have imagined, an opportunity for redemption. "You made a mistake, Ethan," Malcolm began, his voice firm but devoid of condemnation. "But I believe we can all learn, we can change. I want you to participate in a program on unconscious bias." The words hung in the air between them, laden with an offer that was simultaneously simple and profound. Ethan blinked, surprised, Malcolm's offer sounding almost surreal after what had happened. Ethan's mind spun around the proposal. He had expected anything but this. perhaps a suspension or even termination, but never an offer for learning, for change. Malcolm was extending his hand to him, not with disdain, but with something much more powerful, a chance to make amends. And it was this that left Ethan so shaken. Someone he had treated unjustly, someone he had judged without thought, was now offering him a way out, a way to repair his mistake. The veteran officer, who for so many years believed he had all the answers, was now faced with a choice he never anticipated having to make. Participating in a training on unconscious bias meant admitting that he, a man proud of his judgment skills, had flaws, had blind spots. And this admission, more than anything else, was the true challenge. Would he be able to look within himself and confront those flaws? But the alternative was even worse. Continuing as he was meant, remaining in the darkness of ignorance, repeating the same mistakes, perhaps with even graver consequences. Ethan knew he could not follow that path. He had always believed in justice and doing what was right, and now, for the first time, he was being challenged to apply those values not just to others, but to himself. With a deep sigh, Ethan finally raised his eyes to Malcolm, the decision forming in his mind. "I accept," he said, the simple words laden with meaning. Malcolm merely nodded, a faint smile appearing on his lips, as if he knew this moment could change everything. For Ethan, that was the first step on a journey he never imagined he would need to take, a journey that involved not prisons or handcuffs, but something much harder, redemption itself. The days that followed that night were different from anything Ethan had ever experienced. By accepting Malcolm's proposal, he found himself in a completely new environment, far from the streets and patrols he knew so well. The training program on unconscious bias was not just a simple classroom with lectures and educational videos. It was a mirror, a raw and honest reflection of everything he needed to confront about himself. Right from the first day, Ethan realized he was in unfamiliar territory. The activities were designed to dismantle all the certainties he carried with him. There were exercises that made him confront his own assumptions, moments that led him to revisit past experiences with a new perspective. For Ethan, each session was like peeling away a layer of himself, revealing truths he was unprepared to face. At first, he resisted. Like a soldier refusing to drop his weapons, Ethan fought against the lessons being presented. The ideas that his actions might have been influenced by something as insidious as unconscious bias were hard to swallow. But as the days passed, something began to change within him. The walls he had built around himself started to show cracks. One of the most striking activities involved reviewing past situations, moments when he had made snap decisions, without a second thought, based solely on instincts he had always believed to be reliable. Now, with the training, Ethan saw those decisions in a new light. They were choices made from biases he hadn't even known he had, shaped by a lifetime of experiences and influences he had never questioned. The weight of these revelations was overwhelming. Ethan, who had always prided himself on being fair and steadfast, began to see how much his own judgment had been distorted by ideas he hadn't even recognized. And this realization was both liberating and painful. Liberating because, for the first time, he understood what needed to change. Painful because it meant he had been part of the problem for far longer than he wanted to admit. With each passing day, Ethan felt the resistance within him diminish. The man who had started the training filled with doubts and defenses was slowly transforming. He began to see the world differently, recognizing the complexities of the people around him, and, above all, realizing that true power did not lie in his authority as a police officer, but in his ability to understand, to learn, and to change. As the training progressed, Ethan started to realize that true transformation was not just in the classes or the exercises, but in the reflections he made outside of them, in the moments of silence when he returned home. Every night, he sat alone in his living room, letting his thoughts organize themselves, as if the pieces of a puzzle were finally finding their place. The lessons of the day echoed in his mind, bringing to light memories he had buried long ago, decisions that, at the time, seemed so right, but that he now saw in a new light. There was one night, in particular, that Ethan couldn't shake from his mind. An incident he had until then considered a victory. He had detained a young man for suspicious behavior, and later, the boy was released without charges. At that time, Ethan didn't think twice, he just moved on with his job. But now, he began to wonder, why did that young man seem so suspicious to me? The answer, he started to realize, lay in biases he had never recognized, let alone confronted. These thoughts accompanied him in each training session, where he began to share his experiences with the other participants. At first, it was difficult. Admitting his failures, especially as someone who prided himself on being fair, was like opening an old wound. But the more he spoke, the more he realized he wasn't alone. Others also carried their own stories, their own battles against the biases that shaped their lives. And it was in this environment of vulnerability and honesty that Ethan began to understand the depth of the impact his actions could have. Every decision, every snap judgment, was not just an isolated mistake, it was part of a larger pattern, a web of assumptions and biases that affected not just him, but the whole community. What had once seemed like a simple work routine now revealed itself to be something much more significant, something that could change lives for better or for worse. Over time, Ethan began to notice a subtle shift in the way he viewed the world. He became more aware of the words he used, the thoughts that arose in his mind without him realizing. And this new awareness was not easy. It challenged him at every moment, forcing him to question his own reactions, to rethink everything he thought he knew about the people around him. But at the same time, this awareness brought a sense of relief, the understanding that he didn't need to be perfect, but that he had the responsibility to do the best he could. Ethan realized that this journey of reflection did not have a defined endpoint. It was a continuous process, a daily choice to be more attentive, more aware, more human. He began to see that the true power of a police officer was not in their ability to control or judge, but in their capacity to understand and connect with people in a fair and empathetic way. And it was this revelation that began to shape the new Ethan, a man who, although still seeking redemption, now understood that this search was, in itself, a form of redemption. As the weeks passed, something profound began to change within Ethan. The resistance he felt at the beginning of the training, that inner voice telling him to follow the path he knew so well, was replaced by a new desire to make a difference in a way he had never imagined before. Ethan, who for so many years had prided himself on his firm stance, now found himself filled with a desire to be part of the change he recognized as so necessary. He began to apply what he learned in training to his daily life, not as an obligation, but as a new way of seeing the world. In his patrols, his approaches became more careful, not just in relation to what he saw, but to what he thought and felt. He forced himself to pause, to reflect before acting, to question his assumptions before making decisions. And this change, although subtle, began to make a difference not only for him but for everyone around him. Ethan realized that his transformation could not be complete if it remained solely with him. He began to talk to his colleagues about what he was learning, not arrogantly, but as someone who wanted to share something valuable. In the conversations during shifts, during coffee breaks, he introduced questions that would have been unthinkable before. What if we thought differently? What if we acted with more empathy, provoking reflections that planted seeds of change in everyone who listened to him? It didn't take long for Ethan to become an active voice in the precinct, advocating for the need for reform, for a new approach that put humanity at the center of police work. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Many still resisted, clinging to old ways of thinking and acting. But Ethan was determined, and this determination began to inspire others, showing that change, no matter how difficult, was possible and, above all, necessary. His new posture did not go unnoticed either by superiors or by the community. People who had once viewed him with distrust began to notice the difference, and the trust he was slowly building began to spread. Ethan started participating in community meetings, listening to people's concerns, something he had never done with such openness before. He became, gradually, a defender of the justice he had always wanted to be, but now with a much deeper understanding of what that truly meant. And so, Ethan's journey led him to a point of no return. He knew he could never be the police officer he had been in the past. The transformation he had begun within himself expanded to his work, his community, and even his personal life. He had become a living example that the true strength of a police officer did not lie in their ability to impose the law, but in their ability to see beyond appearances, to understand the complexity of the lives they encountered, and to act with an empathy he hadn't even known he possessed. As Ethan became more involved in the change he had initiated himself, a new dynamic began to emerge in his life. The relationship with Malcolm, which had started in such a tense and unexpected way, transformed into something Ethan could never have predicted, an unlikely yet powerful partnership. They began to work together, united by a common goal that went far beyond what either of them could have achieved alone. Malcolm, with his experience as governor and his vision for a more just future, found in Ethan not only a transforming police officer but a dedicated and tireless ally. Together, they began to shape initiatives aimed at reforming the police, not just in practices but in mindset. It was hard work, requiring patience, perseverance, and, above all, a clear vision of what could be achieved. Meetings between the two became frequent. They discussed plans, strategies, and how to implement changes that would truly make a difference. Ethan, who had once seen Malcolm merely as someone he was supposed to obey, now viewed him as a mentor and friend. The ideas that emerged from these conversations were not merely theoretical, they were practical, designed to impact the real lives of those who most needed a fair and empathetic police force. The mutual respect that developed between them was based not only on admiration for each other's skills, but on a shared understanding that both had much to learn. Malcolm, as experienced as he was, saw in Ethan a perspective he did not possess, that of someone who had lived amidst the ranks, who knew the daily struggles of a police officer, and who was now willing to change things from within. Over time, this partnership began to show results. The first reforms started to be implemented, small changes that would soon become significant. Ethan and Malcolm knew there was still a long way to go, but each step taken together brought them closer to a greater goal. And it was not just about changing the police, it was about transforming the relationship between authorities and the community, creating an environment where trust, not fear, would be the foundation of everything. As this relationship evolved, Ethan realized that the true strength of change lay not just in laws or policies, but in the people who had the courage to look within themselves and choose a different path. He and Malcolm, two men from such different worlds, now worked side by side, not just as governor and police officer but as partners in a mission that both knew was greater than either of them individually. And it was in this unexpected union that Ethan found a new purpose, a purpose that, while challenging him, also inspired him to continue fighting for a better world. The impact of Ethan's transformation, combined with the close collaboration between him and Malcolm, began to spread like a silent wave, touching lives far beyond what they could imagine. Ethan's story, of a police officer hardened by routine becoming a fervent advocate for deep reform, started circulating among the precinct's corridors, gaining strength with each new conversation. Colleagues who had once seen him merely as another veteran began to notice the change, and with that, a seed of curiosity and inspiration began to sprout. In roll call meetings, where discussions had previously been limited to the operational issues of the day, debates now emerged about how they, as police officers, could improve their relationship with the community. Ethan, who had once been known for his cold pragmatism, now led these conversations with a passion that surprised even the most cynical. He spoke of empathy, the importance of looking beyond appearances, and how each approach, each decision, could impact someone's life in ways they might never know. The changes were not confined to speeches. Ethan began to propose and implement small actions within the precinct, from training for his colleagues to creating discussion groups on prejudice and social justice. And, little by little, these actions began to yield results. Colleagues who had once acted on instinct began to rethink their approaches, to hesitate before making snap judgments. The precinct, an environment that had for so long been dominated by rigid routines and a certain indifference, began to transform into a space where reflection and shared responsibility gained ground. Ethan's story also began to echo beyond the precinct walls. Communities that had once viewed the police with suspicion began to notice the difference. Residents, once cautious, started to feel more comfortable approaching, conversing, and even collaborating with police officers. The fear that so often kept people away from the police was gradually being replaced by a new form of relationship where trust, though still fragile, began to be built. But the biggest surprise for Ethan was realizing that his own transformation was inspiring others. Young police officers, fresh out of the academy, began to seek him out for guidance, eager to follow a different path from the outset of their careers. And Ethan, who had once seen his role as something rigid and unchangeable, now felt responsible for guiding these new colleagues, sharing not only what he had learned, but also what he was still discovering about himself and the world around him. And so, the transformation that began within Ethan expanded, touching lives and changing mindsets. He not only became an example of how change is possible, but also of how this change could inspire a larger movement, capable of transforming not just a precinct, but an entire community. And with each passing day, Ethan became more certain that, although the journey was long and challenging, it was worth continuing, for true justice, which he now understood deeply, was not a destination but a path he was determined to follow. As time went on, Ethan and Malcolm realized they were facing something much larger than they had initially imagined. What began as an effort to correct a personal mistake had transformed into a life mission, not only for them but for everyone around them. And this mission was far from complete. Each step they took, each conversation they initiated, each training they implemented was part of a journey that now guided them across the country. Ethan, who had once hardly imagined leaving the streets of his city, now found himself traveling to different regions, spreading the message of empathy and justice to precincts and communities facing similar challenges. He and Malcolm were invited to speak at conferences, debates, and meetings with community leaders and police officers, where they shared their experiences and the lessons they had learned together. The impact of these conversations was profound, awakening both admiration and a genuine desire for change in the places they visited. The partnership between Ethan and Malcolm, which at first seemed unlikely, had now become a symbol of how collaboration between different worlds, the political and the law enforcement, could result in something powerful. They not only spoke of reform, they lived it, demonstrating that when two people from vastly different backgrounds unite for a greater good, the impossible becomes possible. Throughout these travels, Ethan felt that his own transformation was continually being tested and reinforced. He encountered police officers who, like him in the past, were trapped in their routines, blinded by prejudices they barely recognized. And he saw in each of them an opportunity to plant a seed, to initiate a process of change that he knew could transform lives, just as it had transformed his. Malcolm, for his part, used his position and influence to open doors that had previously been closed, ensuring that the ideas he and Ethan promoted had real reach. He understood that true change would not happen overnight, but with Ethan by his side, he saw that they were building something enduring, something that could withstand the pressures of time and circumstance. And so, Ethan and Malcolm continued their mission, not as heroes or figures of prominence, but as men determined to make a difference. They knew there was still much work ahead, that each city, each precinct, and each community presented new challenges. But they were ready. And more importantly, they were together. What began as a night of error and prejudice had transformed into a journey of redemption and hope, a journey that they now shared with all those who, like them, believed that true justice is built day by day, and every gesture, in every decision, in every choice to see the other as they truly are, a human being, deserving of respect and understanding. And so, Ethan and Malcolm's journey shows us that true change begins within each of us. But now, I ask you, how many times have you made decisions based on assumptions you didn't even know you were carrying? How many times have you judged someone without truly knowing them, without giving them the chance to see the human being behind first impressions? This story is an invitation for all of us to reflect on our own attitudes and the way we treat others. What if you could be part of this change? What would you do differently from now on? Don't wait for transformation to come from the outside. It starts with small choices, every day. Ethan's journey shows us that it's never too late to learn, grow, and above all, act with more empathy and understanding. If you felt moved by this story and believe that these messages are important, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any content that helps you reflect and become a better version of yourself. And don't stop here. On the screen, you will find other videos that can further inspire your journey. Click and continue this walk with us. Together, let's transform our lives and the world around us, one step at a time.